series talk. Thank you, Sandy. And as you are aware, we are recording these sessions so that you can listen to them later, or you can go back and watch them again. I am Tracy Bigelow. I'm the principal HR partner for EESA, and I'm introducing David Alumbaugh, who joined us in 2019, I believe it was.
Yep.
And he's going to talk a bit about his career. And again, this is part of the sort of mentoring program, the desire to give our early career staff or any staff an opportunity to hear about the career paths of their colleagues. And actually, it's exciting, I think, for anybody to just hear about and learn about some of our coworkers, especially in this time where we're all offsite. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to David to introduce himself. And David, it's all yours.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tracy. Thanks for inviting me to do this. Just to let everybody know, I notified Tracy and Sandy of this earlier. I've had problems in the past with my computer freezing up when I share my screen on Zoom. I've hopefully taken all accounts to not have that happen today, but if suddenly my voice goes away or I can't show slides anymore, you all know why. So anyways, yeah, I've named this this talk Jumping Around in the Applied Geophysics World because I've had a number of positions since finishing graduate school. And so I think that was one of the reasons Tracy invited me, is there was some interest to have a presentation from somebody that has had a career also outside of the DOE complex as well as within the DOE complex. So start with, as all the other talks have done, and give you a little bit of background where I grew up and whatnot. I was born and raised in Ventura, California. Ventura is very similar in retrospect in terms of its proximity to LA as Santa Cruz is to the Bay Area. It's a small beach town that feels a little bit isolated from the bigger cities, but still has all the the benefits of being close to those bigger cities. And it was really a beautiful place to grow up. These are some pictures of me and my family. So this is my mom and dad. My dad was a PhD chemist that worked at the Naval Civil Engineering Laboratory as a civilian in Port Hueneme, California. My mom had a master's in education, taught elementary school. This is me as a toddler being held by my cousin, Mark Alambaugh. This was me right up here about with big buck teeth when I was about maybe 9 years old. Here's me in junior high school in my baseball outfit. I was an avid baseball fan, still am. This was my high school graduation picture. And this is a picture of myself and my parents taken from a family history that a cousin of ours produced. And this is my brother, Jim, right here. And this was about the time where I was post high school, but I was going to a junior college located in Ventura. We'll get to that in a moment. Now, why Earth Sciences? Well, as a young kid, and I'm literally talking like 5 or 6 years old, I became very, very enamored with volcanoes, and they were just like the most interesting thing to me. And I remember, in the late 60s, early 70s, when the first Xerox machines came out, our local library got one. It cost like a dime per Xerox copy to be made. And I would go to the library, get dropped off by my mom, and I would get all the pictures of all the books on volcanoes and then make photocopies of them and take them home and put them up on my wall, because I was just really, really into volcanoes. And I was also into earthquakes, or not in a like I really wanted to experience them kind of sense, but just the geologic, the geology of it really interested me. And I experienced my first big quake when I was 9 years old. It was the 6.5 San Fernando Valley earthquake, or sometimes called the Sylmar earthquake. It caused quite a bit of damage in Southern California. I remember my dad waking me up at about 5 a.m. in the morning saying, "Hey, there's an earthquake. Let's go stand over in the doorway." Because that's what we did in those days, is you stood under the doorway because that's where the house was thought to be most strong. Now, we didn't suffer any damage really in Ventura, but we felt it. But my parents took us down to tour some of the damage a couple months later. And I remember driving by this. This is a Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. A new wing was collapsed during the earthquake. So it was, it really did cause quite a bit of damage, especially for that time in California when we really hadn't seen anything since the 1906 quake. Another big thing that influenced me to go into the geosciences were two oil shocks that happened in the 70s, 1973 and 1979. The 1973 oil shock occurred because, for those of you that aren't aware of this, because the Middle Eastern countries were protesting against the US's support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War. So they stopped sending oil to the US. And right down here, you can see the price spike that caused right in 1973. And then the 1979 oil crisis happened when I was in high school. And this one was generated by the overthrow of the Shah of Iran and the overtaking of Iran's government by I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it was basically the clergy and the religious, I don't want to call it religious right, but the religion, the clergy basically took over the government. Let's just put it that way. And they stopped because of the US's support of the Shah of Iran, they stopped shipping oil to the US. And so that caused another price spike right in here. Now, why did this affect me? Well, I was at that time in 1979 at Buena High School, and I graduated in 1981. And I would say about right when I was getting ready to graduate, that last year when I was a senior, our local newspaper, the Ventura Star Free Press, came out with an article about the top 10 careers for the future. And one of the careers that was listed towards the top of that was geologist or geoscientist. And I remember seeing that and saying, oh, cool, that's something I'm really interested in. That looks like a good career for me. And so my parents were big believers in the community college system and getting the first 2 years of college under your belt while living at home. And so I went to Ventura College, which was, right there in my hometown, and spent 2 years there, got an associate arts degree. And while I was there, I took my first geology field course. And we basically, first geology course in general. And as part of that, over spring break, we went on a week-long field visit. And we went through the high desert of California, examined the San Andreas Fault, behind LA, and then up in the Owens Valley, and saw some really, really cool geologic features that further enhanced my enjoyment of geology and geological sciences. So I graduated from Ventura College in spring of 1983. And during the process of deciding where to go, decided to go to San Diego State University to pursue my bachelor's degree. The reason for going to San Diego State, I have to admit, it was I put all the blame or give all the credit to one of my best friends and roommate. We were both considering either going to UCSB in Santa Barbara or San Diego State. And he took a summer course in cobalt programming at UCSB and didn't like it at all and said, hey, you know what, let's go to San Diego State. And I said, sure, that sounds great. So anyways, we headed down to San Diego to look at it. And I remember at that time walking into the geological sciences department and saying, yeah, I'm here, I'm applying for admission in fall of next fall, and this was 1983. And I'm wondering what the job prospects for your graduates are. And 1983, if you go back to this curve right here, that's right where oil is starting to decline in price, right in here. So when I was talking to people there, I was told, well, with a bachelor's, you really need a master's degree in geology to get a job these days. But if you go into geophysics, the oil companies are hiring geophysicists at the bachelor's level because it's such a hot area to be in. And I thought, okay, great, that's perfect. I do well in math. I did okay in high school physics, and yeah, that sounds like a really interesting thing. So I showed up in fall of 1983. And a year and a half later, as part of the curriculum at San Diego State, you were a geological sciences major, but then you got to choose an emphasis. And they had different emphases. There was geophysics, there was hydrogeology, there was geology, there was structural geology, geochemistry. And so I was in the geophysics emphasis, but even in the geophysics emphasis, we still had to take at least one geologic mapping course. And the reason I wanted to show this is some of the pictures I took on my geologic mapping course. It was over the winter break in 1985. So it was January 1985. And one of the things that this helped me to realize was that I did not want to be a structural geologist, and I did not want to have to do structural mapping because I was not very good at it at all, especially when you got into areas like this where it's just a mess and whatnot. And so, at that point in time, it just further solidified that I was going to be a geophysicist. I put this picture here because this is what you can't tell really, but this is when I got out of the field and I hadn't shaved for 3 weeks, and it was the first time I had any sort of facial hair. And my roommate thought it was really funny, so he took a picture of me. So one of the things that's come up in the previous career talks that I wanted to just keep the discussion moving on is the concept of mentors, professional mentors that we've had. And I met what I consider my first geophysics mentor in the fall of 1985. It's a guy named George Jurasik, professor of geological sciences at San Diego State. I am still friends with George. He's 80 years old now. Just talked to him about a month and a half ago. He was wanting some information about the labs, just in the work they're doing in climate science and whatnot. My initial interest in applied geophysics and especially electromagnetic methods is due to George. He's a great friend. He's a great mentor. Anyways, I graduated with honors in the summer of 1986. This is up here in the left corner. That's George and I later on. I'll mention a course that I got involved with him, where I co-taught with him later on in my career. Anyways, moving on. The other thing George exposed me to that had a huge impact in me going into geophysics was he was teaching a kind of an honors summer school field course where you had to apply for and be accepted. It's called the Summer of Applied Geophysical Experience, or SAGE. Pre-COVID, it was still happening on a yearly basis, even though George is long retired, but he was one of the original co-directors. And it was a course that actually the DOE put quite a bit of funding in up front in the early years. It was run out of Los Alamos National Lab, with most of the funding coming from Department of Energy and NSF. As it got later and later in its career, in the last few years, DOE has been putting no money into this. NSF still puts some money in it through the Research for Undergraduates program. And it had become mostly funded by industry, because industry thought this was such a great course that they really wanted to support it. At the time I went through SAGE in the summer of 1986, it was a six-week field course. 5 of those weeks were spent out in the field actually collecting data and analyzing data. And then the last week you had to write up, which was something that was basically expected to be the equivalent of a senior's thesis. And it was a lot of work at that time. It became a 3-week course later on in its career, and currently, if it continues into the future, will be a 3-week course. These are just pictures of New Mexico. This really helped to give me a love for New Mexico and the wide open scenery there, which would be important in my first job out of graduate school. And just to prove that I'm in Los Alamos area, this is me holding up a radiation sign that was attached to this tractor right here in Los Alamos Canyon, where we were shooting a seismic refraction survey. So that was my undergraduate experience. Now, in terms of the early careers, I did get some I had a couple of jobs that were geoscience related in these years. First of all, in the summer of 1985, I had a summer internship at Chevron, who in those days had actual offices in Ventura. And they were managing basically the offshore platforms that now sit offshore in the Channel Islands in the Santa Barbara Channel. They're no longer owned by Chevron, but in those days they were built and owned by Chevron. So there's quite a bit of work going on in the oil industry there. Those offices obviously have since been closed, and the nearest office is in Bakersfield. Also, starting the fall 1985, I happened to get a job with a small oil company called Macy and Mershon Oil Incorporated. This was the guy that I worked for. His name was Paul Mershon. He and his partner, Bill Macy, had started a small company in Colorado right at the beginning of the first Arab oil crisis. And they had it had been perfect timing for them. And they had made enough money such that Paul could say, you know what, I'm tired of Colorado. I'm going to get a private jet. I'm going to live in San Diego. And then when I have to come back to Colorado, I'm going to do so on my private jet. And so he had a pilot's license and everything. And anyways, we had a small office in San Diego. And basically what my job was to take weekly reports that we would get in regarding new wells drilled or wells shut in within the Denver-Julesburg Basin. And I would just plot them on maps. And so it was a very simple job. I wasn't really doing much in the way of geology. It was more of a GIS job in those days. In the fall of 1986, after I graduated, I stayed one more semester at San Diego State just to take a hydrogeology course. One of the things about EM methods that really fascinated me and really drew me to them, unlike seismic methods, which are mostly sensitive to the rock matrix and how lithified the rocks are, EM methods were very sensitive to and primarily sensitive outside of base metal mining to the fluid filling the pore space of a rock. And so because of that, I decided to, I got more and more interested in groundwater and hydrogeology. And so I decided to take this course at San Diego State, which then landed me a job starting in I think it was late fall 1986. I went to work because this was at the time, oil prices were crashing. They didn't really have much work for me at Macy and Mershon. So I had to find another job. And so I found this job with a company called Applied Hydrogeologic Consultants, which was basically an engineering company. Once again, this taught me that another thing that I didn't want to do, because basically what I was doing for them was working on, it was right after California passed the gas tank laws where you had to prove that your gas tanks weren't leaking in the groundwater. If drill holes showed that they were, you had to dig out the tanks, dig out all the contaminated soil, possibly put wells to extract groundwater that had been contaminated and whatnot. And so I spent a lot of time in trenches taking soil samples and passing them on to the chemists that were on site to evaluate it for hydrocarbon contamination. And it just really wasn't the funnest job in the world. So now, one of the things that, as I mentioned, George Jurassic was my first mentor. And when I started to think about graduate schools, I went to George and I said, hey, I'm really interested in electromagnetic methods. And, can you suggest some of the best graduate schools for electromagnetic methods in geophysics? And so he said, well, yeah, there's a guy at MIT. They have a program. One of my best friends and my advisor, his best friend was a guy named Jerry Holman. His advisor was Stan Ward. George had done his PhD at Berkeley. And he said, yeah, they've started a program at Utah that's really a top-notch program. There's a pretty good program up at the University of British Columbia. Toronto has a long-known good program. And then George I like to liken it like he kind of put his arm around my shoulder and looked longingly in the distance and said, but Berkeley. Berkeley's got a great program. I think you should go check out Berkeley. So I came up to Berkeley in the fall of 1986, and I met who I consider my second geophysical mentor, along with what I would call sub-mentors. Frank Morrison. Many of you know Frank. He long time up at LBL as well as a professor on campus. Retired a number of years ago. Once again, still have a long-lasting friendship with Frank. Talked to him a couple of weeks ago, I really consider him a valuable part of my life. Also at this time when I came to visit, I met a couple other people you may know, namely Mike Wilt and Ed Nichols and Tom Daly, all of which were graduate students in what we called engineering geoscience. Now, engineering geoscience was basically a subgroup within a department that no longer exists on campus, or at least not all of it exists. It was called at that point in time the Department of Material Science and Mineral Engineering. And the mineral engineering part of that department then contained what we would consider economic geology and economic geophysics and other methods. And so there was actually at that point in time really two strong geophysics groups on campus. The one in the department, which is now Earth and Planetary Sciences, and then the engineering geoscience group that Frank led. I didn't even, once I came to Berkeley and met Frank and the other people and experienced Berkeley as a place to live, I didn't apply anywhere else. I went straight, I just said, okay, I'm going to Berkeley. Now, while working here, or while going to school here, I had to live through a couple of natural disasters. Number one, my second major quake, the Loma Prieta quake, which occurred in 1989. I just love this headline because in reality, hundreds did not die. But the San Francisco Chronicle had to predict that hundreds died in order to get a front page out the next day. So anyways, I kept this just because that part of it was so wrong. Also, I lived through the East Bay fire. This was, there hadn't been a huge fire in the East Bay Hills for a number of years, and in 1991 it happened. It's very similar conditions that we see when, say, the Santa Rosa fires have happened recently, and other fires have happened around here and up in the Sierra foothills. And just a hot, dry day with the wind from the east, and somebody's barbecue got knocked over, and next thing you know, hundreds of houses destroyed. I don't know how many people died. I can't remember, but it was really quite a disaster. Also, at that time, I found another creative outlet. While I was in San Diego, I had a creative art outlet in that I like to take pictures. I like to go down to Point Lobos and some of the other beach places and take pictures. When I came to Berkeley, I'd played guitar since I was a young teenager. And when I got up to Cal, I just met some people and started playing, and suddenly found myself in a band called A Different Kitchen. I won't go into how I got that name. Here's my brother again. He was the drummer in the band. Here's me down here. Notice the hair length's getting longer. This was early on. This was later. And we actually cut a CD in 1992 and then broke up on tour of the West Coast supporting the CD. We were in Portland, Oregon, and I just decided, you know what, the music industry sucks. I'm not really getting along with all of my bandmates. I'm having more fun writing my PhD thesis than I am being in a band. And so I quit. The band broke up, and I finished my PhD, which is the cover page is shown right here. It's not so much present in the title, but the main thing I was doing in my PhD was I was helping Mike Wilt, who had since moved on from graduate school to Lawrence Livermore, and who was developing this Crosswell electromagnetic imaging tool. I was helping him to get this up and running, and as well as to develop some analysis tools. And I'm still working on this system, and Mike is too. In fact, the system that we used collecting field data out at the Richmond Field Station for my PhD thesis is a system that was recently transferred from Livermore to LBL, and that we're currently improving to take up to the CAMI site in Alberta whenever COVID lets us, as well as down to a site in Florida for the BEST project that Jens and Abdullah are leading. So I've been basically working on this since my graduate days. So long running history there. Notice the hair here. This is when Frank was signing my thesis. I would say my COVID cut has reached almost to this length. So yeah, I'm looking forward to getting a haircut sometime soon. But anyways, here's, the whole graduation. So my first part of my career, the first 10 years of my career out of grad school, were academically research oriented. I started and spent 6 years at Sandia National Lab. I was brought on as a postdoc at first and then converted to a senior member of the technical staff in 1996. I was brought on by this guy right here. Many of you may recognize this guy. This is Greg Newman, who transferred to LBL after spending about 10 years, I think, at Sandia, 10 or 15 years at Sandia's. This is Greg out of his element with me collecting field data. He was not much of a field person. And then this is him with his family. We went a couple years after we moved to New Mexico. My ex-wife and I, we went on a camping trip with him and his family to go climb Blanca Peak in Southern California, which is Southern Colorado, sorry, which is a 14,000 foot peak and the highest peak in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Once again, I was in New Mexico. Remember that I had really enjoyed New Mexico when I was, participated in the SAGE program. And so it was really natural for me to go back to New Mexico. And Greg brought me to Sandia to work on the type of stuff that he worked on, which was computer modeling and inversion of electromagnetic fields. And so, and we were working to port codes that were developed on standard serial machines to what were then known as massively parallel computers, and today would be known as a kind of standard cluster system. This is the first paper that we published on it. It was really fun and computationally trying. I consider Greg my third geophysical mentor, whereas George taught me about basic geophysics and how to collect field data. Then Frank really taught me about electromagnetic methods in geophysics. Greg taught me about numerical methods, and I owe a lot to him in terms of learning a lot about inversion, different ways of modeling electromagnetic or geophysical fields in general. And so, yeah. So this was my first job out of grad school. And though I just wanted to mention, though the computational modeling projects brought me to Sandia, over time I got more and more involved with field projects funded by the Department of Energy environmental remediation programs. At that point in time, the DOE realized they really had some problems in terms of how they had disposed of wastes during the 1950s and 1960s. And they were working to remediate those sites. So I got involved in a couple of different projects, either to look at electromagnetic techniques to map waste sites, or look at using electromagnetic techniques to monitor fluid flows in the subsurface. Now, while at Sandia, I had held an adjunct professor's position at New Mexico Tech. And in addition, to be quite honest, I had really kind of put my eyes on becoming a professor back when I was in graduate school. I just thought it was the coolest thing to teach students, to do research, all these things associated with a research university. So in 1999, I took a position at what was known as the Geological Engineering Program, which was housed in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Now, during the fall, Madison is an absolutely beautiful place. And that's when I was brought out to interview. During the winter, it becomes gray, gloomy, icy. And for a kid that was raised in California, and also for my ex-wife, who was also raised in Southern California, the winters were pretty hard there. This is an example of doing field geophysics during the winter. This was an interesting little project where we tried to map leftover ore in a reclaimed mine site up in northern Wisconsin, and using the EM methods. And we ended up having to dig out my car because I obviously got it stuck in the snow. But it was really great working with the students, but it just really was hard on my family. Number one, my wife and I had moved there with an infant and no family or friend support structure. The climate, and to be quite honest, the lack of topography was difficult to deal with. Growing up in California, it was much more temperate climate, and we actually had mountains, whereas in Wisconsin they didn't. And I really got to the point also of like, I really didn't care if I never saw another dairy farm or a cornfield in my life, because it's just, there was a lack of any diversity in the landscape. Also, the academic life at a major research university was much more stressful than I expected it to be. I thought going in there with 6 years of postgraduate experience under my belt, that it would be pretty easy to get tenure, and it wouldn't be that much of a change, but it really, really was a lot of work. I'll get to that in a moment. I have a description of comparing LBL to an academic life. So in summer of 2003, my wife at that time and I decided to leave. I had just as a side note, I had just attained tenure. So a lot of people say, you're the only person I know that gets tenure and then leaves rather than staying at the position. But it was really, we were both pretty miserable there. And so upon the return to the Bay Area, I did a 1-year sabbatical with Rosemary Knight at Stanford, working on her, getting her water center going, and also did some consulting with EMI, what was known as EMI Schlumberger now. EMI stands for Electromagnetic Instruments. It was a company that was started by Frank Morrison, along with Ed Nichols. And later, Mike Wilt joined. He left Livermore to join EMI to open up a borehole division. Prior to Mike joining, EMI primarily manufactured magnetotelluric gear. Mike then brought in the borehole division and got Schlumberger so interested that they decided to buy EMI, and then form what they called the EMI Technology Center, which was located in the same trailers out in the Richmond Field Station that EMI had been founded in. And so by going to work with EMI, this provided me a reconnection with Frank, Mike, and Ed, as well as a number of other people. And unfortunately, I don't have any pictures from that time other than this one. The primary responsibility for me at Schlumberger, and this starts the part of the talk that's going to focus on the oil industry and my life in the oil industry. The primary responsibility at Schlumberger, which was a service company, not an oil producing company, was commercialization of what they call, or what got named, the Deep Look EM system. And this was basically, I was commercializing my PhD work, which is kind of cool because not everybody gets to do that, especially not with a major company like Schlumberger. Schlumberger still has this system. They don't get very many surveys because number one, it can't operate between two steel cased wells. So you either have to have an open well or a fiberglass cased well, or specially drilled chromium well cased wells. So there was that aspect. There was always the aspect that if you were going to try to use production wells, you had to take production wells out of production, which reduced the money. And it just, it was what it really came down to was it was great for imaging things like water floods during a pilot study where an oil company was trying to figure out how to optimize their water floods for enhanced oil recovery, but it definitely was not a day-to-day use type tool. So, as I mentioned, Schlumberger still has this system. They still have it on their website. They still advertise it. Mostly now, I would say it's used for what they do is they tell a lot of their Middle Eastern clients, oh, you should, if you're announcing a request for bids, you might want to have the option of having cross-well EM and cross-well seismic in that bid, just in case you want to do some. And the clients will put that in there. And because Schlumberger is the only service company that has this technology, then they're kind of the only one that can get that bid. And so they're using it mostly as a marketing tool these days rather than an actual production tool. Also, while at Schlumberger, my group worked on other EM technologies, namely marine CSEM or controlled source EM. This became a very big hot item topic in the early 2000s. It was billed originally as a direct detection mechanism for detecting oil versus water in offshore reservoirs. And, a lot of people were talking about this at the time it came out as the next big advance over post 4D seismic or 3D seismic, sorry. And so Schlumberger invested quite a bit in this. They purchased a company called AGO in 2005. AGO was basically the field crew for ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil were doing quite a bit of offshore CSEM work in offshore Africa. They immediately then got in a lawsuit with EMGS, which was a service company that only offered this technology, and that was a spinoff from Statoil. The lawsuits really, I would say they never really fully got resolved, but at some point, Schlumberger decided, that it just really wasn't worth it. They weren't making any money. They were spending a lot of money with docked boats, and to be quite honest, no one really ever made a lot of money with this technology, just because it's so expensive to do offshore surveys. Also, at that point in time, Mike started working on surface to borehole EM technologies within Schlumberger. We're still trying to figure out when this technology works and when it doesn't. It's not as straightforward as some of the other methods like Crosswell and CSEM. It was a really enjoyable time at Schlumberger for me. I was working with a really smart group on really interesting projects. I had, something like 7 PhDs that were reporting to me. They all knew what they were doing and they were trained, and it was just a really fun time. And during that time, I co-authored 7 peer-reviewed papers. More importantly, to the industry, published 14 patents, or was co-author on 14 patents. As you find, if you go into industry, you'll find generally patents are considered more important than peer-reviewed papers. So it's one thing to consider. And also at this time, Schlumberger gave me full ability to interact with Cal in whatever way I wanted to. And so I went through the process and got adjunct professorship at Cal, and ended up teaching quite a few of, at least half, if not the whole, applied geophysics course every fall semester. And when I co-taught it, was co-taught with Jamie Rector. Although I think I might have co-taught it with Doug Drager one time too. Anyways, great time at Schlumberger. However, beginning in 2009 and 2010, the stability of remaining in the Bay Area with Schlumberger started to go south. First of all, for cost-cutting reasons, as you will see, is a reoccurring theme in the oil industry. Schlumberger decided to move all the hardware engineering that was going on at EMI to Houston. Okay. And the hardware engineering was basically, we were up to 80 people at one point in time at EMI with Schlumberger, and basically 70 of those people were probably on the hardware side. So they wanted to move all that to Houston. They also had, at that point, divested of the marine EM offering. As I mentioned, it was just hard to make money with that technology. Mike got transferred to the Middle East to promote the Crosswell EM to the Middle Eastern oil companies. And then a little bit later, Ed was transferred to Paris to work on a casing corrosion estimation tool at the Schlumberger headquarters in Paris. Now, granted, Schlumberger realized the people that were working with me probably would not move to Houston. at least not at that time. And thus I had a group of 8 researchers that they wanted to maintain here in Berkeley, that were working on, valuable topics for them. And so we found an office across the street from the Berkeley Rep. It was a great place to work, especially when I was teaching on campus, because I could just walk up to campus. And I was basically there for 2 years before the unconventionals revolution and lower gas and oil prices caused by the unconventionals revolution really caught up to me. And basically Schlumberger started squeezing its budgets. Around the same time too, a new CEO came into Schlumberger. Andrew Gold was the CEO when I was there most of the time, and he really had this vision of better characterizing the interwell space in producing oil fields, and hence had really put a big effort into this deep look technology like the Crosswell EM provided. But around this time, he was replaced by a guy named Paul Kipsgard. Paul was a driller, and his main focus became putting all the sensors as close to the drill bit as you can, and not having to put extra tools down holes and whatnot. And so because of the low oil prices, our budget started to get squeezed for my little group in Berkeley. I was getting pressure from my management to either transfer or let go of staff. And about that time, Chevron announced that they needed somebody to work with Mike Hoverston out in San Ramon on EM methods. And both talking to Dimitri Beos, who was my manager at Chevron, and many of you have met at the time, he basically said at some point, I can't quote him word for word, but it was basically, given Chevron's history of being based in California, there's a much better chance of a large research group surviving in the Bay Area within Chevron compared to Schlumberger doing the same thing. And so I joined Schlumberger in 2011, September of 2011. Mainly I was working on marine exploration and CO2 injection monitoring. And of course, once again, here's that reoccurring theme of Houston. Within a year, an announcement was made by Chevron management that they were going to move all geoscience research to Houston within the next year. I was told that I could participate, I could be one of the lead initial participants in what's called the Core Research Program, which is a collaboration with various Bay Area research institutions like LBNL, Stanford, and Lawrence Livermore National Lab. But in 3 years, I was told I would have to move to Houston because the positions within the core research group, the Chevron positions that would be based in San Ramon, would have a 3-year rotation to them. Now, given the way things turned out, I could have likely remained longer in the Bay Area because Mike Hoverston, who was in this core research group, as well as the rest of the people that were in it, we were able to stay here up until last year. But this last reorganization that Chevron held this last year basically moved every geoscientist to Houston. So there is no more geoscience research going on in California. Because also at this time, by this time I had become divorced and I had joint custody of my 2 kids, 50% custody. And I didn't want to have to move to Houston and be separated from my kids. And my ex-wife made it pretty clear that she would not be moving to Houston. So I was left with trying to find another job. And I had already been talking to this geoscience startup, Neos Geosolutions, prior to joining Chevron, but the timing to join them just wasn't right at that point. But now in 2013, things had picked up for them and they said, yes, we would love you to come work for us. They had their main corporate office was in Pleasanton, California. So I had a little bit more of a commute from Berkeley to Pleasanton, but still it was a good experience. I'd never worked with a small startup before. I was brought on to lead their EM exploration effort and as well as kind of spearhead their physics-based multi-physics integration capabilities. Now, when I joined Neos, they were offering an airborne EM measurement that turned out not to be well researched and not to be well thought out. and not to be technically validated. And so the first things that I did in that first year that I was at NEOS was show that this technology was not measuring what they thought it was measuring. And therefore, we discontinued working with the provider of that technology, as well as offering that technology, and became more focused on looking at how to use sparse ground measurements, which are more expensive to collect, but can offer deeper sensitivity to deeper regions in the earth, along with airborne technologies, which you can get very high density spatial coverage, but you don't get much depth penetration. And this is just an example of where we collected airborne with sparse ground MT in the Raton Basin, in northern Raton Basin in Colorado. This was actually looking for CO2 fields. The client was basically, they produced CO2 field from this place called Sheep Mountain, and then through pipelines shipped it down to the Permian Basin to use in enhanced oil recovery operations. So it was a really interesting experiment, and we were really just getting to the point where I think we had a solid technical offering to offer when oil prices plummeted and projects dried up. And so, therefore, in May of 2018, I found myself without a job as NEOS was closed. There's also some tales of a nefarious investor that had invested in us and was expecting certain things to happen. And I don't want to spend the time going into that, but it was a perfect storm, basically. And so I found myself without a job. I started contacting various people I knew. I'd already been in contact with Tom Daly, who was at that time managing the geophysics group up at LBL. And Tom said, you know what, this is the process. We'd love to have you up here, but we got to get this process going. And so once NEOS officially closed, I at that point, Jonathan had taken over the group. Tom was retiring. I started talking to Jonathan, and as well as Mike Wilt, who was now, he and Ed were at LBL. They were trying to get the cross-well system up and running again, and they really needed somebody to manage that system. So I started talking to them. I also started talking to Chevron again to see about the possibility of going back to Chevron. But at age, I think it was 55 at that time, finding jobs in the oil industry outside of Houston is very difficult. And just finding a job in general, I will say there is a bit of ageism out there. And I'm seeing it in other industries with friends and family members that are having problems right now. And so it took quite a while to get the process in place and go through all the interviews and whatnot. During this time, I joined a small consulting group called Blue Green Geophysics, which I still do very small data analysis projects with. And just for everybody's reference, I also, to get some exercise and relieve the stress through exercise, I was riding a pedicab on the San Francisco Embarcadero a few days a week. I was in better shape during this time than I've been in years. And unfortunately, I've lost that now during COVID. But anyways, as Tracy mentioned, in 2019, I came to LBL, and it was really to lead various EGD programs related to electromagnetic instrumentation, development, data acquisition, and interpretation. Currently at LBL, I have 3 projects related to CO2 storage that I'm kind of leading the efforts on, or certain aspects of the effort on. Got a couple of geothermal projects funded, and I'm currently in negotiations with Forge to get our LBL project up and running there. And then just recently, due to my ground penetrating radar that I'd done back when I was at Sandia using crosswell acquisition geometries, recently got a project with the Border Patrol to look at tunnel detection along the southern border. And we're currently, Evan and Mike Hoverston and I are going to go through the process of negotiating a project with Chevron to look at making various and interpreting various data sets collected with EM data sets collected where we're using steel cased wells, or there's a lot of steel infrastructure in the area. So that's what I'm doing now. Now, this is probably what a lot of people were hoping to get out of this. Well, I'm going to spend a couple slides just giving you my perspective of work at LBL versus in other industries. So first, let's talk about the oil industry versus LBL. I'm sure you all know compensation is better in the industry. You've got a higher salary. There's usually year-end bonuses. There's stock options. All of those things we don't have at LBL. Now, I will admit, when I was in the startup, NEOS, although I had a higher salary, I did not get the year-end bonuses. And I did get stock options, but of course, going out of business, so stock options went to basically zero value. Now, on the other hand, I think if you want to be in the Bay Area, LBL is just way more stable for a long-term position. It's not as subject to changes in the commodities market as industry. And here I could both say the oil industry or the mining industry for that matter. LBL is subject to changes in political climate, but I don't think those changes are as knee-jerk reactions as you get from the oil industry. As I've mentioned several times, the oil industry is extremely Houston-centric. Overseas transfers happen quite often, and you're basically just told you're going to go. And I personally found that at least the management within the oil industry doesn't really care about your family. They don't care if your family gets uprooted. And they would, when I went through the rift with Chevron, they were saying, oh, don't worry, we'll offer your spouse job training down in Houston, or we'll help them find a job in Houston. But there was no real, they just made it sound like it was such a great deal that you're moving to Houston, and everything. It was just really, it was rather, I don't know, inhumane in a way. And I think that's present in other industries, but it's especially bad in the oil industry. Now, workload-wise, I feel that industry provided a somewhat less stressful environment compared to LBL. And that's just because we're in a soft mining environment here. And so I find myself these days, well, ever since I've been here, always somewhere in the back of my head, I'm looking at other opportunities to bring in more money, and then juggling the 9-10 projects that I have or that I will have, it's not an easy thing. So, in industry, you were given a project, that project was defined for you, and you didn't have to worry about your budget. Sure, you could make pitches to business units and whatnot. They may say yes or no, but you always had a salary and you didn't have to worry about bringing in other money. Now, LBL, I would say, provides many more options for you to work on that interest you. In industry, it's always an emphasis to work on projects that will produce profit for the company. And also, LBL not only allows you, but encourages you to publish your research. Publishing can be discouraged in industry. I remember we wanted to publish some of the results on the Crosswell system and how we were doing casing corrections and whatnot. We got to publish SEG abstracts, but then Schlumberger came back and said, no, we're giving away too much information about how we do this if we publish in a peer-reviewed journal. So a lot of stuff never made it to peer-reviewed journals. Of course, the weird thing is a lot of the details were published in patents. So, there was a little bit of a weirdness around that. But you wouldn't publish a lot of times the scientific knowledge that in patents that you would need to publish in a peer-reviewed paper to get that peer-reviewed paper published. So anyways, that's what I kind of see the difference between working at LBL versus the oil industry and maybe the mining industry. I also wanted to put in a slide about my perspective of working at LBL versus academia. I'm going to say it straight out. Now, this was based on me coming out of Sandia National Labs, where I had 3, maybe 4 projects that I was managing, and then going to a university. Not coming out of LBL, where I've got 9 projects that I'm managing and then going to a university. But I would consider, at a research university, you're going to have the same research workload that you have at LBL, plus the additional work associated with teaching classes. And when you're trying to get tenure and you have that pressure of tenure hanging over you, it's really a lot of stress. This was my time at Wisconsin was the hardest I have ever worked in my life. And I was all day at school, coming home and being with my family for a few hours. And then when they went to bed, going back to work every night and then working some, a large portion of the weekends. So it was very rewarding in that I got to work with students, but it was really a lot of work. Now in academia, in terms of soft money versus, hard money, you only need to bring in your summer salary. If you want to work during the summer, you can always make the choice not to bring in summer salary. So that was a benefit. They also had at many places, including Wisconsin, and I think Berkeley has the same thing. If you bring in an overage of summer salary, you can buy out your teaching load. So if you want to teach less, you just basically buy it out using some of your summer salary. Now, one nice thing about being academia, you can consult. It's, LBL has that option too. I still am continuing my consulting on a very small level, but it, does give me that connection with the outside industrial world. And back to the teaching, if you want to teach, LBL does offer that flexibility. So if, it might almost be, if you want that academic experience, it might almost be less work to get an adjunct position on campus in one of the departments and, teach that way, work with students that way, rather than getting a whole tenure track position. Just my viewpoint and my experience. So with that, I want to finish out with what I call my career learnings and tidbits of job wisdom. First of all, do what you like. I didn't get into this career path because I thought it would make me a lot of money. I'm still really, really interested and really, really like what I'm doing. Second thing, the grass isn't greener on the other side of the fence. It's just a different shade of green. There's always pros and cons of choosing a new job. You'll always find something that's great, but at the same time, you'll look back, or at least my experience is I looked back and said, oh, I kind of missed that part of the old job. Third, keep in touch with your mentors. I really value my friendship with my mentors and the continued, not only friendship, but the intellectual talks that I have with them, especially Frank. In fact, we're going to meet sometime in the near future and talk about this gravity gradiometer that's being developed on campus and possible use of that for CO2 sequestration monitoring. So really value your mentors. Explore other technologies and avenues to work on that interest you. That is, don't get too locked into one particular field of research. It's difficult with the number of projects that we need to support ourselves here at LBL to keep a good work-life balance, but really, I think this is essential. You've got to have other outlets besides just spending all your time working. And along those lines, I'd like to promote, keep your creative pencil sharpened. Find other sources of creativity. This is a video actually. So 2 new sources of creativity that I have been doing since I've gotten back in the Bay Area the last, say, 5 or 6 years is I've taken up DJing. This is me at an event over in the city a few years back. And then my fiance and I have also gotten into video mapping as an art form where we basically project on various things. And this is basically projecting on 2 water towers that were located at this abandoned PG&E plant over in San Francisco. And that's, having that other creative outlet, I think really keeps my creativity and enthusiasm going for the work I do here at LBL. And so with that, thanks for listening. And I'm open to any questions. And wow, I went long. Sorry about that.
Anybody have any questions? I'm looking, let me just look through here. Got some people that are, I don't know if you can see So, I mean, if anybody has any questions, just speak up. I know, David, you did such an excellent job of like probably answering so many of the questions that people may have. Does anybody have any questions? I'm going to try to pull up the gallery here.
Yeah, and Tracy, just so you know, I can't see the gallery because I just have my laptop screen. I guess I could do this.
Yeah, you can probably drop it there.
Yeah.
That's good.
Okay.
And I know we had a few people, there are a couple chats here that people made comments about your thing, and thank you for the insights. Let me just see. Is there anybody else that's bringing up a question? So does anybody else have any questions or concerns or?
Love your comment, Tracy.
Your rock and roll picture looked a little bit like Bono. I thought that was very cool. You're kind of in sync there.
Just one question to David. So you mentioned that you have about 20 patents, yeah?
14 patents, yep.
14. Do you make any money from that or?
No, but publishing patents greatly influenced your bonuses and the ability to get stock options.
Okay.
So the patents, you know, when you work for a company, the company retains all rights and royalties to those patents. But, you know, because a company like Schlumberger and Chevron, they rely on their patents to be able to either corner certain parts of the market or just to be able to work in a certain area. That's Chevron's perspective, is they don't want to be shut out of working in with a certain technology because they don't have a patent. So so when you do that, then, you know, when it comes to your yearly review, a patent will always help in, you know, getting you a raise or a bonus or possibly stock options. So
Thank you.
Question, yeah. Anybody else have any questions?
No,
Go ahead.
I thought you did a great overview. It's kind of like a little bit of like ping ponging. It's like, this is working out. I like this. I love the fact that you tried it. If it didn't work, but every experience was still a learning experience. So
yeah.
you get something away from it.
Thanks for that, Reed. I gotta admit, the move from Wisconsin out here without a permanent job, that was a big, you know, that was trying, you know, just saying we're going to make it work somehow or another, you know, and it was a big risk, but it worked out in the end.
Wait, hey, I'm from Illinois.
Yeah.
Exactly what you're talking about. And there's a lot of motivation with the snow shovel.
Yeah. Yeah.
Totally respect that. And I especially like what you had to say about keep your creative juices going.
Yeah.
That it is important that it isn't just all work, that we do have to have something to kind of free the brain up, because I find I'm more creative when I'm not focusing on a problem and I'm just vacuuming, driving in the car. All of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, here's another way to look at something. So
yeah, and I've got to admit, one thing I didn't explicitly clarify, but those years in Wisconsin, and then when we returned to the Bay Area, I had put that creative side to the side, especially in Wisconsin. I didn't have time for it. And I know that helped to lead to a certain degree of unhappiness because I didn't have that other outlet. So
I think it depletes you, definitely, if you don't have that creative side at all. Yeah. And I think, I mean, I think it's so great. I mean, some of the more senior people had to drop off, but I think your advice on just that keeping the creativity and maintaining that work-life balance, in spite of the fact that, you know, we feel like there's just always too much to do. There is always going to be too much to do, I think, no matter where you are.
Yeah.
Unless you sit at a job that just is, you know, very boring. And so in order for it to be stimulating, it's probably going to be too much to do, but I think you have to have a meditative response to it. It will get done. If it doesn't get done, I'll have to figure out what I'm going to do, you know, and you just have to do that. So it's nice to see that you've really learned that balance. And yeah, you did really, I think out of anybody that we've had that's spoken in their career, you've really done the most in terms of moving around from different institutions. And that's
the title.
Yeah.
Well, I enjoyed it. Thank you very much for taking the time to share. It was great.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody else? No? I know we're a little after the hour, so maybe people can direct their questions directly to David if you wanted to ask him. But David, thank you so much. This has been so enjoyable. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. And you'll hear about future announcements for future career path talks. So thanks.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.